Welcome to part 2 of our look at different genres of photojournalism. Remember, this is the talk where we're looking at the fact that photojournalism isn't one big thing, that there's smaller subsections of it. And last time we talked about breaking news photography. Now we're going to talk about features photography. Now sometimes this is called entrepreneurial photography or features shooting. This is kind of like feature reporting is in the writing side of things, but done for photography. This is often done with non-obvious stories, non-breaking stories, or stories where the photographer has to go out and investigate, go out and find the right source, find the right person to make the story happen. And oftentimes it's also constructed in a way where one single photograph isn't what does it. It is a series of photographs that are all packaged together and they build off of each other, and the order matters, and perhaps it's chronological, or perhaps it's all the capturing different settings, but that the order of the story matters. And just like breaking news photography, there is a Pulitzer Prize for this. This is the Pulitzer Prize for feature photography. And it is awarded every year along with the other Pulitzer Prizes. And this is the type of photojournalism that you're doing in this class. And the reason why is because as much as I would love to have you go out and take breaking news photography and grade you on it, we'd have no idea when breaking news is going to happen. It's sort of the nature of breaking news. And so until they invent magical crystal balls where I can know when something's going to happen you can go take pictures of in a breaking news capacity, I have to have something else I can grade you on consistently. So not only that, but also I think it's good for your brains to go out and find the story, go out and seek the story, to find the sources, to put yourself in these settings that aren't immediately obvious. I think you can do a lot of amazing storytelling that way. And a quote that goes around a lot when you're talking about feature photography that I think is important is that it's a variety of images that add up to the greater whole. So just like how I'm grading your assignments this semester, it's important to remember with feature photography, when you're building a photo story, the single photograph isn't as important as the greater collection, the greater story it tells. So let's look at a couple of examples of feature photography and photo stories. The first one is an example. This was a Pulitzer Prize winning photo story from the New York Times in 2015, looking at volunteers who have gone to countries in West Africa to help combat the spread of the Ebola virus. This is important because of the timing. This is long after the rest of the news world had stopped paying attention to Ebola. The news had already moved on. Yes, Ebola was a hot topic for a while, and when the United States brought someone with Ebola over to the CDC to be treated, that was a big story. But after a while, the news moved on and paid attention to other things, but the Ebola virus was still there. So the point of this story was to look at the public health volunteers who had gone to help people there, even though the rest of the world has stopped paying attention. So we'll start with this story, which acts a little bit as chronological and works through the progress of what is a day in the life of one of these health volunteers like. And it starts off in the morning with a prayer. They meet in a small chapel and they pray for the safety of themselves as well as the safety and health of the people that they are going to be going around and helping during the day. It's a very calm, peaceful shot compared to what the rest of it is going to be. We now see them gearing up to go out and start entering homes and helping people out. And in the background, we get that sense of the story. We see people preparing. On the right-hand side of things, we see someone getting their hood ready. We see someone looking through a bag to get equipment out. On the left-hand side, we see someone working to tape up the area between the sleeves and the gloves of their chemical suits to keep them protected from the virus. But then in the foreground, we see the woman who appears very distraught at what's happening. And I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition of the bright white, clean chemical suits in the background and the woman who's very distraught in the foreground. Moving on, we have a photograph of some of the volunteers who have picked up a young kid and are moving him to a clinic. He had been showing some symptoms of the Ebola virus, and so they were bringing him to be checked out. He was too weak to walk on his own, so they just picked him up and carried him. And that really gives you a sense in a storytelling capacity about how stretched thin and desperate things are. If they had all of the equipment they needed in the world, they wouldn't be carrying him like this. They would have him on a stretcher or a sling. But they don't have the time nor the resources, so they just sort of have picked him up and are walking with him. Also, I really like, from a composition standpoint, how, despite how depressing and dire this photograph is, it's also very, very bright and colorful. You have the very bright sky blue corrugated metal in the background. You have the bright yellow chemical suits in the foreground. You have the orange on the child's sweater. It almost tricks your mind when you look at it because of that. We're then back at the clinic where they're taking people who are sick and trying to help them. And this is a photograph of the two different clinic wards. You can see the person who is leaving the framing, the door frame, with a bucket of fresh water, water bottles he's bringing around to people. And you see the individual on the other side who's doing the same thing. His bucket is set down outside the door. If you look through the door frame on the far side, you can see that there's individual clean tents set up to try to contain people, or at least contain the spread of the virus. And also you get a sense of just how dire the situation is, because you can't identify any human aspect of the volunteer workers at this point. They have goggles over their eyes, they have tape covering their neck and their area between their sleeves and their gloves. They are trying to limit contact in any way possible. And just from a standpoint of a single photograph, it's got great framing using literal door frames. You've got the mirror in the middle of the shot that sort of splits it in half. Color temperature wise, it's very cool. It's almost got sort of a blue tint to it. It's a very striking photograph. And then as we're thinking about this in terms of a story, we do have the ending of the fact that part of the job of the health volunteers is to properly bury people who die because of the virus. The virus can stay on bodies for a while, and that becomes a contamination issue. So they have to get people buried, and so that is the end conclusion. They are burying folks who have died from the virus. Notice they still have their chemical suits on. The gravediggers in the background who are staying clear don't, but the people who are handling the body do. So you have this, again, really interesting juxtaposition of this is a very natural looking environment. There's mulch and dirt and trees and vines. It almost looks like it could be part of a nature documentary. But then you pair that with the folks who are wearing bright yellow, bright white chemical suits with goggles, and it looks very unnatural. So it's a pairing of two different worlds together. Now, all of these are good individual photographs, but what's powerful about them is that they work together to tell the story of these public health volunteers, to tell the story of people who the news isn't otherwise paying attention to. So let's look at another example. This is an example from the New York Times as well, and this is a photographer who tracked the recovery of one of the folks who was badly hurt in the Boston Marathon bombing. This is someone who was near the bomb when it went off, or one of them when they went off, and ended up having to have both of their legs amputated above the knee. And so this is a photo series, a photo story of their recovery process. Now, this is what really sets this apart from breaking news. Breaking news photography of the Boston Marathon bombing would be if you were at the scene and you had your camera ready and you take pictures of the ensuing event and rescue of people. And there's plenty of amazing and powerful photographs that exist of that, of breaking news photography of the Boston Marathon bombing. But this is a feature story. So what the reporter did, the photographer did, was track down somebody who they knew was badly hurt and follow their recovery process. This is a really great example of a powerful feature photo story. It is after the event is already done and it is tracking the aftermath. So we start with a photograph of the victim who's in his hotel or in his hospital bed, and his significant other who's in the chair next to him. And one of the things that I just really like about this photograph is that you can, even though you can't see all of his head, you do get a sense that he's smiling. You get to see his cheek is sort of pushed up over the edge of where the sheet is. You get a sense that he's smiling, and I think that sets the tone for the fact that this is not someone who's going to be beaten by their condition. So we start off here in the hospital room. We then move on to a little bit later in time. We're looking at this chronologically. And now our person is getting the stitches removed from their wounds where they've had their legs amputated. Of course, you can see that they're wearing Boston Red Sox shorts. Really becomes part of the identity of a part of the story of it being in Boston. You also get a little bit of a grimace face because it's probably not entirely comfortable for him, but it really does help set a mood, tell part of the story. Moving on now, we have our subject who's getting dismissed from the hospital. He's got a really pensive look on his face. And one of the things that you don't immediately go to, the entry point to the photograph to me is his face, where he looks very, very pensive, like almost worried about going back out into the world. It isn't until later that you notice that he's gripping his two hands together really, really tightly. You can see that the color is starting to change around his knuckles. He's gripping his two hands together so tightly. And to me, that's a really powerful, small detail that you get, as well as the fact that this also explores the family impact. That's his mother, who is looking at all of the discharge instructions and all of the rehab timing that he's going to need. We now have our person coming back home after having been out for a little bit, and we see that the photographer has positioned themselves on top of these stairs. This is a shot from high, shooting down low. We see the light coming through the rails on the stairs, reflecting down on the ground. And we have then in the background our subject coming up to the stairs. We get a sense that the stairs are something sort of looming in front of him. There's something that he's going to have to learn how to conquer as he gets used to his life after this has happened to him. And finally, we wrap out with him in a rehab facility where he's being fitted for and is learning how to walk on his new prosthetic legs. He's got a grimace on his face. This is still him in the learning process. But we've gone from him in the hospital bed initially to him now in a rehab facility learning how to walk again. This is a perfect example of a feature story. It tracks the victim after everything's already happened. It tracks one of the victims and how they're learning to recover. It's a very powerful and I think a great example of a feature photo story. Now, for your photo stories, one of the things that really makes all the difference in the world between something that is an amazing, great, powerful photo story and one that just kind of feels like it's a random collection of pictures, it just feels like a bucket someone tossed a bunch of pictures in, is planning. Both of these examples that we've looked at have had tons of planning involved in them. That's something that is a big advantage for photo stories. Breaking news, we don't have the advantage to plan oftentimes, but with these, we know ahead of time what our subject's going to be. We know where the settings are going to be. We know what some of the actions are going to be that they're doing. So we can already start thinking ahead about the types of photos we want to get, about the things and the little small anecdotes and stories we want to tell along the way. So we can already start to think about how do we want to position ourselves? What kinds of shots do we want to get? What angles do we know we want to get? How do we want to work with lighting? We can already start to plan this stuff out. And back when I was putting together photo stories, I would actually go and get a legal pad and a pencil, and I would sit down and actually sketch out or list out the stories I knew I wanted to get, or the photos I knew I wanted to get in that story. I would either sketch out part of a room, or I would sketch out part of a scene that I knew I would want, start to maybe shade things in for lighting that I knew I wanted to get, or just make a list. So for example, one time I worked on a photo story of a guy who makes wood tiki sculptures. He has a wood sculpting shop, and he has lots of saws and tools. And so I knew, hey, these are the types of angles I want to get. I know I want to get a really low shot of this guy using a saw to saw off a log. I've never been to his shop, but I know what he does and how he works on it. So I just know that's a picture I want to get. And so I list out the shots I want to get before I go, so I know to sort of check them off as I'm there. So consider doing that for your assignments. Consider literally making a list or sketching out the stuff you want to get before you go. So this has been feature photography, or entrepreneurial photography, and hopefully you're able to see what sets it apart from breaking news photography, and why this is the type of stuff you're working on in this class. Now next, we're going to look at portrait work, and that'll be in part 3.